Welcome to the August 2023 CCC webinar, Current and Forecasted Collision Industry Trends. I'm Paul Berry, Executive Director for CCC. The Collision Industry Electronic Commerce Association, or CCC, develops and promotes electronic communication standards that allow the collision industry to be more efficient. We also provide webinars like this one to help educate both members and non-members on trends that impact systems, processes, and the exchange of data across the industry. Today's presenter is Bart Mazurek, Vice President, Automotive Services Group Consulting and Services with CCC Intelligent Solutions. Bart has more than 20 years experience in the industry, including 17 with CCC and 4 with Accenture Consulting. As we start the webinar, I want to remind you that there is no verbal communication between the participants and the presenter. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the question panel on the webinar screen. We will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. And now, I'll turn the program over to Bart Mazurek.
Thank you, Paul. Much appreciated. I'm excited to be here and share this information with the industry. So, as we walk through these industry numbers, I hope it gives everyone an opportunity to kind of see patterns as to why you're seeing, certain things in your place of business. So before we actually jump into the numbers, I want to walk through a couple of housekeeping points. The first one is just kind of some definitions and some assumptions. I'll be referring to DRP industry information, and that's claim level data specific to the DRP or the direct repair programs that CCC runs. And then when I talk about national industry information, that's a mix of DRP, open shop, independent appraiser information, as well as carrier staff data. And then when we get into the operational review, that's going to exclude open shop and total loss claims. So effectively, you can look at it as kind of repairable only. And then finally, when I talk about any industry information at all, whether it's DRP or national industry, it's a comprehensive view from data across all states. And then as me and my team, as we prepare presentations like this, we like to look at the data from 3 different perspectives. First, we have lagging indicators, which are effectively historical patterns, and they largely show historical view data mostly presented or prepared for by the US government, like the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And then CCC's data, I kind of look at it as a point in time indicator. So it's various metrics that we share, like total cost of repair, parts, labor, cycle time information, but it's really a snapshot of kind of where this particular metric is today. And then finally, leading indicators. Leading indicators are really a prognostication of the future. Now, we at CCC tend not to try and prognosticate too much, but there are certainly think tanks that we read up on that do provide some predictability or predictions, if you will. So we try and include that just because it makes the story more interesting, quite frankly. So, of course, the next 30 or so slides, we're going to be talking through 3 levels of information. First, economic factors, and those are largely kind of macroeconomic trends. And then we're going to get into repair complexity and finally operational review. So with that, we're going to kind of jump into the high-level data. First, the economic factors. So as we look at mileage driven this year is a pretty solid representation of 2022. But when we compare it to 2019, it's actually fairly similar, except for the April timeframe. Other than that, 2023 has been very similar to 2019. And then kind of as we look at the right side of the deck here, notice that 2023 is actually seeing a noticeable bump compared to last year. So overall mileage is up. And then it's interesting, we certainly see quite a bit of information around gasoline prices because people's wallets sometimes dictate how much or how little they can drive. and gas prices have been kind of all over the board. There's been more variability than we've expected here recently. And so, for example, over the last month, we've seen gas prices go up almost 30 cents. In California, it's north of $5 a gallon. Mississippi, it's still very reasonable at just over $3. But generally speaking, prices are noticeably less expensive than this time last year when we were hovering north of $5. And when I look at these analyses or these projections kind of going out into next year, the expectation was that we were going to be at or kind of close to $4 a gallon overall. But given some decisions made by OPEC and this heat wave that's really affecting refineries' ability to produce gasoline, the projections have ticked up a little bit. So the expectation kind of going into next year is that we're going to be north of $4, but probably not approaching the $5 mark. So here, these next couple of slides really kind of lead into total losses. But before we talk about total losses, I want to talk about vehicle values. Before we even talk about used vehicle prices, first we need to talk about new vehicle prices, because there's a huge correlation between new and used vehicles. And as the market sees more new vehicles available, there's less pressure placed on used vehicles. And so that's evident by the fact that in January of this year, new vehicle prices were well north of $49,000. They've come down almost exactly $1,000 in the first half of this year, because new vehicle inventories are significantly higher. Meaning, to me, I kind of interpret that as, when I drive down the major commercial road in my town, and there's a Ford dealership and several GM dealerships, a Toyota, BMW, and probably 5 others. Now each one of those lots has significant inventory. So those dealerships are now competing against one another to sell vehicles. Whereas a year or a year and a half ago, you'd see very few vehicles and people were kind of buying whatever they could get regardless of their loyalty to a particular brand. So now there is a significant price pressure down on new vehicles, and we're seeing MSRP or sale prices close to MSRP and even below because of incentive plans. And actually, we're only 0.4% higher right now compared to a year ago. But we are still $10,000 higher than we were 3 years ago, and that's, I think, concerning for the market, because people are really kind of priced out of being able to purchase new vehicles. So therefore they turn to used vehicles, and used vehicle prices peaked in Q4 of 21. And since then we've seen a pretty significant decline in used vehicle prices, which has a pretty significant effect on total losses. And so here we're showing a kind of a 2.5-year view of total loss cycles. And it's important because it does have kind of a standard pattern. And part of that has to do with accident severity and those kinds of things. But a lot of it has to do with vehicle prices. So for example, there's an inverse relationship between used vehicle prices and total loss frequency. So if a vehicle is more expensive, it's more difficult to total loss, so fewer vehicles will be totaled. As vehicles become less expensive, they will become easier to total out. So vehicles are currently easier to total out, so we're seeing a slight uptick in total loss frequency, and that I expect that to continue to kind of through the end of the year. So now we're going to go into repair complexity, and we're specifically going to be talking about total cost of repair. But before I jump into these few slides, I just wanted to kind of preempt it by saying that first I'm going to be showing kind of the overall trend from 2019 through 22, and then I'll present Q1 and maybe even some Q2 data. But then I'm also going to be presenting the last 5 or 6 quarters, because that gets more granular and it helps everyone see kind of these patterns as they really establish themselves kind of on a quarterly basis, and it helps us kind of get an understanding of directionally where things are going. So notice from, in this case, 2020 through, or let's say from 2019 through 2022, total cost of repair went up almost exactly $1,000. And the way that these kind of patterns go is that we see T-cores go up in Q4 and then again in Q1 because accident severity is bigger because of kind of more severe accidents, but also you get more new vehicles or current year vehicles pushed into the market, and new vehicles always have a higher T-core. But what's interesting here is that as we're looking at this DRP industry information on the right side, notice that there's a trend growing. As I look at the total cost of repair stack, notice the dark portion at the bottom, that's labor percentage. Notice that the labor percentage has fallen from 40% down to 38%. And so repair facilities, are now spending more of their resources on the parts versus on the labor side of the total cost of repair stack. And we'll continue to talk about that as we go through the presentation. So here we're looking at effectively the same thing, but this is a quarterly view as opposed to an annual view. And notice you start to see the cyclical trend where T-core rises as the year progresses, and then it kind of flattens out between Q4 and Q1. And we're already seeing the same thing here as we look at Q2 data, but we're not really presenting Q2 data, not because we don't want to, but because vehicles, as we're going to be talking about here in the next few slides, vehicles are taking substantially longer to repair, largely because the vehicles are very complex. And so we're not really seeing the data coming out of a particular really kind of become baked, as we call it, until about 2 months after the end of the quarter. Previously, when cycle times were really quick, it was easier to predict or kind of project it or even present it when we were 4 to 6 weeks after the end of the quarter. But now we're hedging more towards presenting prior quarters data 2 months after the fact, because there can be such a big jump that it's almost meaningless. So now this is a slide that I think is super insightful for the industry. Granted, it's only showing 2019 versus 2022 data, but nonetheless, the story is the same when we look at 2023 data. If we look at the 2019 data, please pay attention to the gray columns, especially the ones in the vertical box. Notice the vertical box where we have repairs from $500 to $2,000 highlighted. Those two columns equate to more than 40% of all repairs, but notice that those two columns have shrunk significantly for 2022. So that means that those two columns now represent only about 30% of overall repairs. So that means that 10% of repairs have now fully shifted over to these higher value buckets. And notice at the very bottom of the screen, we went from 8 to 13 hours of repair for these lower dollar claims to 25 plus hours for the higher dollar claims. And a larger percentage of overall claims are falling into those buckets. So no wonder that cycle times are increasing, because vehicles are just that much more complex and require that much more knowledge and frankly parts to kind of get back into pre-accident condition. So here we're looking at a stack of parts. And so I have highlighted the aftermarket portion because there was an interesting trend as we were in the depths of COVID. Notice that the aftermarket usage went from, call it 18% in 19 and 20 down to 16% in 2022. And that was because most aftermarket parts come from Asia, and supply chain issues certainly took effect. And so there was limited availability of aftermarket parts. And so as we look at that same data, but on a quarterly basis, we see starting in Q1 of last year, it kind of hit its bottom. And then every subsequent quarter, it's increased. And now when we look at Q1 of this year, it's rebounded significantly, and it's really kind of right back to where it was, to its historical norms. And then finally for this section, I wanted to take a look at kind of the crystal ball that I have in front of me. And when we talk about overall TCOR and that 4,444 number that I presented a couple of minutes ago, notice that just an average of all vehicles, and all vehicles are requiring, 15.2 parts, and you're in the 40% in terms of part percentage of total repair cost. But then as we kind of break that up, notice that that's heavily influenced by the 7-year-old and older vehicles, which only require 12 parts. It's substantially lower total cost of repair and substantially lower part percentage, which means that the labor is much heavier on older vehicles. But as we get into newer vehicles, it's kind of the exact opposite story, where it's much more part intensive, because today's vehicles, they have so much more technology that's it either works or it doesn't, and it's not necessarily repairable, so it needs to be replaced. And so the total cost of repair, especially for new vehicles, is quite a bit north of $5,000 already. And the part percentage is also a larger portion of the overall total cost of repair stack. So that kind of gives you kind of visibility into what to expect in the future, as we kind of get further away from 2023, those parts replaced numbers are only going to increase. Obviously, TCOR is going to continue to go up, and I believe that the part percentage of total repair cost is also going to increase. So now we're going to talk about repair complexity, but we're going to spend a couple of slides talking about cycle times. And these are DRP industry cycle times, but what I have highlighted here are just the last 3 key ones, just as points of comparison. And so notice we went from on average of 10.5 days in Q1 of 21, and that really ballooned up to almost 30 days from the total number in Q1, really kind of across all of 2022. But since we've seen the cycle times dip pretty significantly, and a lot of that has to do with parts availability, and we've seen cycle time numbers continue to drop as we looked at Q2 and even now Q3 data. And this is kind of a slightly different view of slightly different information. Rather than going all the way back to 2021, I'm only going back to 2022, because 2021 Q1 was kind of the start of the peak of cycle time. And here I'm showing Q1 2023. But notice that as we look at the green portion of the slide, that's really kind of the repairs. Repair started to repair complete. There's very little difference between the 2 years. Yes, there's a reduction from 15 to 14 days, but the biggest difference here is when we look at last estimate sent to vehicle in. It's effectively a 5-day difference, and that's because most repair facilities pre-order parts, wait for the parts to arrive, and then bring the car in. Well, now their repair facilities are getting parts more quickly, so you're able to start the repairs more quickly. So now we have a new section that I'm really kind of excited to talk about, because everyone's talking about electric vehicles, and Paul and I were just talking about this prior to the session starting, that electric vehicles are on kind of everyone's lips, and I'd like to give the industry better visibility into kind of how some of the projections look, as well as some of the statistics that we're seeing around the repairs that are coming through our systems. So when we look at this graph, we notice that between 2019 and 2023, sales of electric vehicles have tripled. But what I kind of love about this graph is that this was published in March, and I love the fact that it's already outdated, because even though we talk about the growth of EV sales and EV availability, it's really outpaced everyone's expectations. So in Q1, when they sold 259,000 units, that was almost exactly 7% of all vehicles sold in the US. Well, guess what? In Q2, they sold 295, almost 300,000 vehicles. So that's already at the 2024 run rates. So my expectation is that by the time we actually get to 2024, we'll be significantly north of the 1.2 million vehicle mark. And that comes from the fact that every OEM has additional vehicle models coming to market, so brand new vehicles. And I even know of new OEMs that are planning on coming to market that aren't in the market yet. So it's super interesting time, especially for people who love vehicles. And so in doing preparation for this presentation, I did some, I'm constantly doing reading, and I found a press release by Ernst & Young, the consulting company. They did a survey, and they found that 48% of consumers who are interested in buying a vehicle in the next 2 years, 48% of them plan to buy an electric vehicle, which is really fantastic for the industry. But what's interesting is that for those people who aren't interested in buying an electric vehicle, there are really two primary factors. One is the lack of charging stations. So 51% of respondents said that they were concerned about the lack of charging stations. And surprisingly, 57% said they were worried about the safety of home charging. But the irony associated with that is that of those who own EVs, 80% have at-home charging and 81% would repurchase. So every one of my friends and colleagues who have EVs love them and can't wait to, can be on this ride for forever because they really enjoyed their car. So anyway, the industry is certainly on a big upswing, and EVs are certainly leading that. So here, let's jump into the next slide because I've got lots more information on electric vehicles. So here we're looking at a chart. This is just recently published by Cox Automotive. So notice the market share that Tesla has compared to everyone else. Tesla sold 175,000 EVs in Q2. So this is very recent. It's only come in the last few days, even though they produced almost 500,000. So their dealerships have inventory. And Ford, GM, Chevy, Hyundai, and Rivian all sold between 12 and 14,000 vehicles. So they have a tiny fraction of what Tesla is selling, but they all have big expectations in terms of overall production. So for example, both Ford is expecting to sell more than 600,000 vehicles next year, and that's largely between the F-150 Lightning and the Mustang Mach-E. And then GM has revamping their Silverado pickup truck, highly successful, and they built that from the ground up. So they're expecting to do more than 400,000 units amongst their various lines, but the Silverado will play a big part of that as well. So I think that if I were to do this presentation a year from now, it'd be interesting to see how this slide looked. But Ford has been very aggressive about not only stating that they want to be number 2 in this market, but they want to have a very solid they want to make up quite a bit of the gap against all their other competitors. So here we're looking at state level data, and notice that there's kind of a pretty good hockey stick in terms of pretty big ramp up, but this chart, I didn't want to present it to the point where California was to scale, because then most of the other states would be completely insignificant. So California sold or has more than 550 registered EVs in the states, and if Florida has less than 100 and Texas has only 80, I mean, California is more than 5 times more than Florida and 7 times more than Texas. So it's pretty significant in terms of the number of, or the percentage of EVs in California versus the rest of the country. In fact, California has more EVs than the next 12 states combined. Here what we've done is map out all of the EV claims that we've seen in the last 18 months. Now, disclaimer on this data, if there is one claim in one zip code, like for example, in North Dakota, then there is a dot for that zip code. If there are 10 claims in one zip code, like in Northern California or in the megalopolis between Washington, D.C. and New York City, it's still just one dot in one zip code. So it's certainly not a heat map, but it definitely gives you visibility into the frequency or how, frankly, the commonality of overall EV claims. I mean, EVs are here to stay, but notice that they are largely centered around urban areas. And then you got the one in North Dakota. Okay, so I think this gives a better perspective. This is an appraisal distribution across the country. So notice that California has fully 4 out of every 10 appraisals for EVs across the country. Every other state is a distant second. I mean, Florida is number 2 with their 6%, and Texas is number 3 at 5.9, but California has a major lead on EVs. And given one of my first slides and the price of gasoline in California at north of $5 on average, it's no wonder that EVs are as common as they are, because gasoline's almost prohibitively expensive there. So here we're looking at total cost of repair and comparing EV and non-EV vehicles. So for the blue bars, I've removed all the EV vehicles, so you've seen the total cost of repair drop, because even though EV vehicles are just a small percentage of overall claims, they do have an impact on the overall average numbers. But there is about $1,500–1,600 difference between repairing the average repair, or the average damage for an EV versus a non-EV. But a lot of that has to do with, and kind of focus on the second bullet point here, a lot of that has to do with the number of labor hours. So on average, an EV has 34, almost 35 labor hours, whereas a non-EV has 28 hours of repair. So it's a pretty different animal in terms of what the repair facilities are faced with having to repair to get that vehicle back to pre-accident condition. So kind of building off that comment, take a look at, again, we're looking at this T-core stack. And again, I've removed the EVs from the left side, and we're back to our kind of standard view in terms of non-EVs are north of 40%. In terms of lit parts, and then labor at, call it 38%. But then as we shift over to the EV side, notice how it's kind of almost it's more than the opposite, because labor is so intense on the EV side that we're at 46% labor versus 38% labor for non-EVs. So it's a pretty significant amount of physical work that needs to go into getting EVs back on the road. So here we're going to jump into scanning and calibration. So here we're comparing both national industry and DRP industry. I'm mostly going to focus on DRP industry, but DRP industry has seen quite a big jump in the last 5 or 6 quarters here, where now it's effectively kind of standard approach to have a scan done on vehicles, because frankly, vehicles, you can't eyeball all the damage, and the vehicle has to effectively tell you what's wrong with it in order to have a thorough kind of comprehensive view of everything that needs to be repaired. And so to that point, scans are not only frequent, but there's a kind of a progression in scans, and you do a pre-scan, you do a during a repair scan, you do a post-scan, just to make sure that everything is kind of back to pre-accident condition. But I wanted to show you kind of what that looks like when we talk about current year versus older vehicles. And so I've purposely kind of grayed out the middle years because they don't tell as interesting of a story. But notice the blue columns, they show vehicles that are 7 years and older. Even back in Q2 of 21, we were at almost 50% older vehicles being scanned, but now we're up to 70%. But then we compare that to current year vehicles, there's a pretty significant lift going from 67% north of 82%. And I anticipate these numbers continuing to grow, even though they're almost at their little peak. So then let's kind of talk about calibration. Calibration is not as frequent because really ADAS isn't on every vehicle that's on the road, but over the last couple of years, ADAS has really become very frequent, and now it's effectively on, it's on more than 90% of all vehicles being introduced into the market today. So calibration is certainly growing, but I wanted to show you kind of how quickly it's growing, and the contrast here is really stark. Again, we're looking at the older vehicles. Older vehicles, while on occasion require calibration, it's still only at 8.5% even as of Q1 of this year. But notice the frequency of calibration, the explosive growth in it, it's really gone from 20% to 35% effectively just in the last 4 quarters, and last 5 or 6 quarters here. So, and I anticipate that as even more vehicles have ADAS capabilities built in and more ADAS capabilities built in, there are going to be the need for additional calibrations and multiple calibrations will just become that much more common really across the industry. And then that takes me to the second half of the year outlook. So gas prices are going to continue to bump along, but I think given, as we look at the crystal ball and look into next year, gas prices will have come down by then, but I don't anticipate, and frankly, the federal government doesn't anticipate them coming down too much. So we're expecting kind of in the low to mid $4 range as we look at next year. And then vehicle sales, affordability is really kind of the biggest issue. And as long as vehicles remain expensive from the get-go, then there will still be a significant secondary market that will be highly contested. And so when we look at EVs, every vehicle manufacturer is looking to enter into the EV market. And I just read that the expectation is that in the next 10 or so years, 2/3 of the vehicles entering the market will be EVs. Now, that leads to further complexity, as we saw in, for current year vehicles, total cost of repair is already over $5,000, and a lot of that has to do with the increase portion of total cost of repair is due to parts, but on the flip side of that, the EVs show that higher labor is really kind of very common for EVs. Again, back to EVs being more common the further we get into this decade, then I think there's still going to be quite a bit of work for repair facilities to do when it comes to repairing EVs. And then finally, cycle time. Cycle time, I think it'll tick down a little bit, but ultimately, as vehicles maintain complexity, cycle time, I don't think is ever going to come back to pre-COVID era, because vehicles are just too complex and they require too much work in order to get them back kind of into pre-accident condition. So Paul, with that, that's kind of the end of my portion. If anyone has questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Great. Well, thank you, Bart. Much appreciated. I think that was really interesting, particularly how rapidly the EVs are coming into the market. Kind of surprising how fast they're coming on.
Well, so Paul, to that point, I have a number of Google searches that exist, and I'm constantly getting fed more information. So honestly, if I did this presentation in 2 weeks, I would probably have 2 more slides on EVs, because there's so much information that's coming out that it's just super interesting, and we kind of can't even keep up with all of it. So anyway, more to come on this.
Fantastic. Well, Stacy Phillips is our marketing director, and she's been monitoring the webinar for questions. Stacy, do we have any questions available for the attendees?
Yes, our first question is the increase in the total cost of repair largely attributable to the need for more parts, or are there factors contributing to the increased cost?
Parts are driving much of it, for sure. As we've seen just with the current year vehicles, it requires 16, we'll call it 16 parts. That's 4 more parts than vehicles that are 7 years and older. And so it's not only parts, but it's kind of additional. It's the additional knowledge that a technician needs to be competent in fixing a vehicle. So I like to joke that a technician needed to be half artist and half technician. Now a technician needs to be half artist, half technician, and half electrician. So, there's just a huge amount of complexity going into it, and it's all resulting in a higher T-core. I hope that's an acceptable answer.
Thank you. So our next question is, how does repair time change with an EV versus an ICE vehicle?
Well, repair times there's more labor, as I mentioned. There's, I think I said that labor is like 34 and a half hours versus 27 and a half. So with vehicles becoming more complex, repair times are just going to go up. And back to my earlier slide where it just showed that there's this kind of tipping point from easy repairs to more difficult repairs. More difficult repairs are effectively becoming the norm.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions about, has this been recorded, which it is being recorded, and it will be posted online later today. We do have a question. Has there been a smaller percentage of repairs going through DRP as a result of increasing AI usage, for example, straight through processing?
Not particularly. So straight through processing really helps those simple claims and get to a decision point. But if a vehicle needs to be repaired and it's going to be repaired, we haven't seen volumes change in terms of that. So DRP volumes remain strong.
Okay, thank you. So with the growth of EVs on the market, how does that impact labor, both current and future, due to the complexity of EVs?
That's a really great point. And so, there's been a lot of talk about the need for technicians or even the lack of technicians. So my argument is that what a repair facility needed, let's say in pre-COVID times, whether you're talking about 2017 or 2019, is different than what the repair facility needs now, because every vehicle that's new and coming to the market is more intelligent and more complex, and effectively, especially if you're looking at EVs, they are effectively apps with wheels, so they're infinitely more complex. So a repair facility today actually needs more technicians to get more complex work done because each repair is taking longer.
And we have a lot of support from attendees thanking you for great insights. And I think that was our last question.
Fantastic.
Thank you, CCC team. I hope this has been educational. I've certainly enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed the prep. Like I said, if we did this in 2 weeks, it would be even more EV focused. So thank you for the opportunity. We certainly appreciate it.
Well, we'll have to have you back again in the future, Bart, because this is great information.
My pleasure.
As Stacy mentioned, this presentation has been recorded, and it will be available later today at Sika.com. And in addition, you'll receive an email tomorrow with a link to that presentation. I would invite you to check Sika.com for a schedule of future broadcasts and to watch recordings of past webinars. Links are available under the CCAST tab at the top of the page. Sika has partnered with the Automotive Management Institute. Attendees of this webinar are eligible to receive credit towards a professional designation from AMI after taking a short quiz. A link will be sent to all attendees. Please follow Sika's social media platform to stay up to date on Sika events and news. And if you haven't heard, we're having our annual Connects conference next month in Bloomington, Illinois, which features a tour of Rivian. So if you're interested, please visit Sika.com and check that out. And that concludes today's webinar. Thank you all.